The Cask of Amontillado is one of Edgar Allan Poe's last significant works of fiction. It was published just 3 years before his death and only 2 months before the death of his young wife, Virginia, the event that sent him spiraling in his last years. It can be seen as a simple piece of magazine writing that he was so good at, and that he had managed to eke out a career on thus far. It is Gothic horror mixed in with an element of temperance fiction, as David S. Reynolds, the critic, has pointed out. Popular genres for the time. Live burial was a very significant theme of the Gothic genre. Poe himself had written several stories on that theme at this point, and it was a bestseller for magazines in the early to mid 1800s. Poe himself was a master of it at this point. But the story can also be read as a critique of aestheticism in its way. Both the killer and the victim are driven by an irrational devotion to their individual passions. For the victim, it is wine. For the killer, it is for revenge. They are given over to a kind of emotional response that belies any better judgment that they might have had. By indulging these passions, they are marking themselves for a kind of condemnation, even as we admit that it is what makes them interesting as characters. And so they are very much within this dark romantic mold. The destructive and murderous impulses of humanity. It is also significant, I would say, in that romanticism. Very much a quasi-European setting. Catacombs underneath, references to European wines, the little Latin from here and there, the idea that the family has been there in this crypt for hundreds of years. Certainly there was nothing like that in the States. So this is very much before Emerson's call for an American milieu for its literature. So Poe is working in some very conventional modes here. Significantly also, for romanticism, there is no pretense of objectivity here. It is a very close perspective through the killer. He is addressing us individually, and we are brought along on this. It's not an interior monologue, but it is a speech of this character telling us what he has done, telling us everything except the one thing, which is why. And we are within his thoughts in a way. We are dragged into his mind, hesitatingly or not, and we experience the world of the story through those eyes. There is a certain connection, I would say, here with the work that Dostoevsky was doing at the time. Of course, the core of this is the motive. We don't know why. He addresses it obliquely several times about it being revenge. There was a slight of some form. Montresor's feelings were hurt, and so he is lashing back out at Fortunato. Fortunato, of course, means the lucky one, but it also means fate, fortune, fate or luck. The guy is going to be killed in one of the more horrible ways imaginable. But that question that goes unanswered is the real heart of the story. Why? We are dragged through this wondering, well, why? What did he do? Now, perhaps that is a dark curiosity on our own part. Perhaps it is forbidden knowledge that makes it all the more enticing. Ding, 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 Adam and Eve. But the mechanism of this story, the significance of the story, is in this question. why does Fortunato have to die? Why is Montresor leading him away through these dark tunnels in this horrific manner? Why? What was so bad? But as we are being led through this story, like they are being led through the tunnels, we are curious. We want to know. And so we are going along for the ride, led by our own curiosities, our own lust for knowledge, our own intemperate, irrational curiosity. Not unlike the curiosity for wine. Poe's relationship to wine and alcohol and substances, let's say, is well known, and it is curious that he is writing this so near the end of his life, when he has been an alcoholic for most of his life. And from a psychobiographical perspective, this has some significance, just to try and see the obsessiveness of wine and where it could lead. And perhaps he is tutting it a little here, but it's interesting how he is trying to get some objective control over that and express some disdain for it, perhaps. See, this is a temperance novel after all. Equivalence of wine and literature reflects a purely romantic sensibility. Both can be seen as keys to unlocking the irrational, of stripping away all of the surface civilization that we enjoy, and bringing out a more animalistic side of humanity that certainly Poe would feel always on that liminal space between polite society, the genteel Virginia upbringing he had, and the coarser elements of life that he exposed himself through his literature contacts, through his printing, through his extreme poverty, and through his alcoholism. He was always in that space to feel the pressure of both modes of life tugging at him and condemning him. The story itself serves as a prime example of Poe's literary theory spelled out in the essay The Philosophy of Composition, which was published in that same year, where every word of the story drives towards the production of its effect. It is a remarkable example of economy, of focus, and that is a focus on the prolonged effect and unvoiced motive is announced in the first paragraph. You can see it immediately. He doesn't waste a moment. The 10,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as I best could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitively settled, but the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes the redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. It's not a bad opening paragraph here. In an era that really valued an opening paragraph, the direct address in the second sentence establishes a kind of complicity. You. Now, in criminal law, this might merit charges of conspiracy, but in a strictly literary or psychological sphere, it highlights the essential problem of voyeurism, of wanting to know what is going on there. And there is a certain voyeuristic and creepy looking through the windows quality to this. As readers, we want to satisfy our curiosity, perhaps especially for the darker aspects of human experience. That direct address makes readers more self-conscious of this phenomenon, and our curiosity drives us to read more. And with each turned page, we admit the dark impulse driving us more. The lack of moral outrage that might otherwise cause us to reject the story outright becomes quite conspicuous. The direct address further highlights the uncertain nature of the relationship between the speaker and the reader by identifying the readers as, quote, one who so well know the nature of my soul. The speaker, Montresor, appears to be signaling a relationship. Like, you know me, we know each other. We have that bond. You're involved. Now, if so, then perhaps the central question of the motive is a case of tacit understanding. Like, you know. I don't have to spell it out. You know. But if not, and any reader finding that hint in the second sentence of this story would naturally react accordingly, the implication is shock. The casual reader picking up this story would explicitly not know the nature of the person's soul. The implication of intimacy coming immediately after that first sentence that evidences a strong passion for vengeance could plausibly prompt offense, indignation. Moreover, the verb know is a second person plural, and that implies multiple addressees. A single individual within that group might recognize that others, perhaps all others within that group, might indeed know the nature of that soul. Now, psychological group dynamics being what they may, pressure to conform can be assumed among the lurking suspicion about complicity implied in going along with the crowd. The result is ambiguous. It is an alliance that will be tested throughout the remainder of the story, where the reader's reactions are the central element of the drama. Now, the anti-moralism is highlighted in the second half of that first paragraph. Montresor wants impunity. He doesn't want to be blamed. He doesn't want to be held accountable. He wants no consequences for his actions. Specifically, he wants to feel no guilt, as that would contaminate his sense of retribution. The ethics of murder itself are unconsidered. And the final sentence is curious in two distinct ways. Look at it. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. Now, first, it suggests the necessity of the victim knowing the significance of this vengeance for the avenger to feel any satisfaction. Montresor has to have that recognition from Fortunato. The social and psychological valuation clearly outweighs any unmentioned moral or ethical concerns. So that's one thing. That's interesting. But second, this is terrible writing. It is awful writing. This is terrible writing for a purpose, however. Now, look at it. The subject of the sentence is the pronoun it, a pronoun. This drives the reader back to the sentence before to determine the referent, and even there you have to pass backwards again through another it to arrive at the original subject of a wrong. That a wrong is also very indistinct. It is a indefinite rather than a definite article, and once again posing the core question of what is the particular wrong at issue here. We don't know, and he's being flagged in front of us that this is an unknown. This is an X factor. Following that, it is equally unredressed is hampered by several unfortunate characteristics of diction, style, and grammar. Equally splits the verb compound, which is arguably fine in relativistic grammatical terms, but draws undue attention to itself. Unredressed is a negative description and comes as the third iteration of the same base word in those last two sentences. Unredressed, redresser, unredressed again. And it's got retribution clanging around in close proximity, which sounds an awful lot like it. All of these are going to tend to blur in the reader's apprehension when stacked so closely. Plus, that schizo phrasing, the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong, is just flat out torturous. It is terrible, terrible writing. The avenger fails to make is clear enough, but the clause goes off the rails from there. To make himself felt folds back to the clausal subject avenger, forcing the verb into simultaneous passive and active voices, and then as such folds back to that previous sentence as well as to some vague state associated with the status of being an avenger. And while struggling with this tautology, readers are turned again to him who has done him wrong, which leads back to the original question of what exactly is this wrong? This paragraph is a syntactical maze reflected in a hall of mirrors. It is a long, circuitous puzzle that leads its readers through their confusion to deposit them back where they started, achieving nothing but the lost time and an unsettling feeling of what it might mean. This is an obvious refraction of the journey through the mysterious tunnels and catacombs of the story, but this is also, very significantly, the act of reading, of fumbling your way through the dark for no real purpose, and at the end, nothing gained but an evening's entertainment. It's a curiously nihilistic view of literature, but significantly, again, this is one of the final pieces of notable fiction that Poe produced. After this, he generated some of his better poems, and the essay. Some of the better essays come out. The Poetic Principle and the Philosophy of Composition was right around this same time. But this is a kind of swan song. This is a kind of admission that perhaps literature, fiction at least, is nothing much other than a waste of time. It's a conclusion Tolstoy is going to reach in his own way a few decades later. And the implications of that are interesting, but it is curious to see this relatively sophisticated literary theory finding exposition in pulp matter, in what people would dismiss as trash. Critics have long since seized on Poe as a very significant literary theorist and a very significant practicer of literary theory in his art. And so perhaps it's not that surprising, but still, there is a lot to dismiss in Poe. There is a lot of silliness going on. There's a lot of cheap tricks going on, a lot of silly Gothicism. But when you start digging down, you can start to find something much more intriguing, much more subtle and sophisticated and high-minded. He wasn't just playing for the cheap seats.